They're very good at destroying the economy, and that's what we did. They printed almost $7 trillion of new money. Money printing does not cause inflation. You can have deficit spending, but stop calling it stimulus because it's not stimulus. They're not good at stopping the spread of the virus, but they're very good at destroying the economy, and that's what we did. But they cause all these other, even if you don't have the disease, even if you are immunized or you had it and you recovered and you got the antibodies, the lockdown still affects you mentally. It causes depression, anger, anxiety, and ultimately violence. So I trace some of the, not the sole cause, but some of the violence we saw last summer in all these Antifa riots and the violence we saw yesterday on Capitol Hill, in part because people's anger level is so high because of the lockdown. So the point being, yeah, that is what they want. And, Rahm Emanuel famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, this is a good crisis, and they're not letting it go to waste. But getting back to the, people look down their noses at small and medium-sized enterprises. They say, well, you're a restaurant with 20 employees, big deal. You're not Boeing, you're not Apple Computer. Well, I have news for you. Those small and medium-sized enterprises make up 50% of all jobs and 45% of GDP. So individually, they may be small, but in the aggregate, they are half the economy. And you've just crushed half the economy. If you're locked down, you still have to pay the rent, you still have to pay the utilities, some benefits, et cetera. And so you're running negative cash flow, and a lot of them are just going bankrupt. So you go up and down, I don't care where you live, go up and down the streets, you'll see every fourth or fifth store, for lease, closed. They're not coming back. There's jobs are not coming back. The equipment's up at fire sale prices. And by the way, they're not paying the rent because they broke the lease. That's the first thing you do when you file for bankruptcy. The point is, there are ripple effects of this, and it'll go from tenant to landlord to lender to security holder, and it's going to take a year to play out. So we're nowhere near the bottom of this. In 2008, the Federal Reserve balance sheet was $800 billion. Today, it's about $7.5 trillion. So they printed over almost $7 trillion of new money. Where's the inflation? There's no inflation. Yeah, but that's not inflation. I mean, asset prices are up there, bubbles all over the place. I agree with that. Bitcoin, stock market, some sectors of real estate, not all. Those are asset bubbles. That's not inflation. Inflation is what is the consumer price index, or the PPI, the purchasing index, producer price index rather. And you say, well, I got my own definition. Well, fine, good for you, but you're not going to be able to forecast policy if you're making up definitions. You got to look at it the way the Fed does. And I'm not saying that there are no problems with it. I'm not saying the models are right. They're not. But if you're trying to forecast Fed policy and forecast markets, which I do, you better look at it the way the policymakers are looking at it, because that's going to guide their actions. If you want to stay ahead of the curve in terms of policy changes, you have to look at it through their eyes. Whether the models are wrong, I know the models are wrong. I get that. I do my own modeling, but you can't just make up your own definition. The inflation benchmark that the Federal Reserve uses is a PCE price deflator, personal consumption expenditure price deflator. That's the one that's used to determine GDP. And their target for that is 2%. And they've hit that target about 2 months in the last 13 years. In other words, they don't know how to cause inflation, and we don't have inflation. But just to kind of come back to your point, Jason, so we printed the $7 trillion, over $7 trillion we talked about, and the monitor's like, oh, all that money, you're going to cause inflation. We have not. Money printing does not cause inflation. What causes inflation is the velocity of money. It's the turnover of money. But if I stay home and watch TV and don't spend any money, my money has velocity of 0. So a nominal GDP is money supply times velocity. What's 7 trillion times 0? So if you don't have velocity, you don't have economy. So you can think of the money print. There is money printing for sure. But think of the money printing as piling up wood, just piling up. A big pile of wood doesn't start a fire. You need a match. You need a bolt of lightning. You need a blowtorch. You need some catalyst. So if you're worried about inflation, and actually right now deflation is a bigger problem, but if you're worried about inflation, don't worry about the $7 trillion pile of wood. Ask yourself, where's the spark? We've got another problem, which I just explained why monetary policy does not work. Fiscal policy does not work. either. You can have deficit spending, but stop calling it stimulus because it's not stimulus. And why is that? You have to look at another metric, which is the debt to GDP ratio. So how much government debt is there and what's GDP? And a simple example, let's say you had, and these are not the right numbers, but just as an example, let's say you had $10 trillion of debt and $20 trillion of GDP. Well, in that example, the debt to GDP ratio is 0.5. It's 50%. The debt's 50% of the debt's 50% of GDP. Well, what are the actual numbers? The actual numbers today are about 25 trillion of debt and about 22 trillion of GDP. In other words, the debt to GDP ratio is actually around closer to 130%. Your Keynesian multiplier works up to a debt to GDP ratio of about 90%. So what's the Keynesian multiplier? Keynesian multiplier is when you're in a liquidity trap and you want consumption and people won't spend, they save. That's what they're doing today. You know, the stock market was up today because, so Biden's going to be president, the Democrats control the Senate. So that means we're not going to get $600 checks. We're going to get $2,000 checks and more. So the stock market, which usually gets things wrong, by the way, but they've said, all right, with all the stimulus, people are going to get the money, they're going to spend it. Here's your inflation, kind of what you were asking about, Jason. Here's your inflation. So interest rates are going up. That's not what people do with the money. They will get the money. I agree with that. And there will be more deficit spending, but they're not spending it. They're saving it. They're either paying down debt, which economically is the same as saving, or they're actually saving. And look, if you lost your job, of course you're going to save money. You're not going to, you'll pay the rent or whatever, but you're not going to go spend it on a, vacation or whatever. But even people who haven't lost their jobs worry that they might be next. So if you get savings, you're in a liquidity trap. Nobody's spending the money. Look at the math. What's happening? Your debt is still going up by $1, but your GDP is only going up 90 cents. So what's happening to the debt to GDP ratio? It's getting worse. That means the return on the next dollar is lower. This is why you cannot borrow your way out of a debt crisis. Right. You cannot print your way out of a liquidity crisis. You need other solutions. And I talk about the solutions in the conclusion of the book.